Subscribe to the channel. This is where power, history, and silence are examined without comfort. For decades, governments believed control meant borders, armies, and secrecy. Then something changed above our heads. The sky stopped being neutral. Wars were decided before they began. Secrets stopped being secrets. And power no longer needed permission. Today, this technology guides your steps, tracks your movements, and knows where you are, always. Do you accept cookies? For most of human history, the sky was neutral. Armies marched on land, navies dominated the seas, power was measured by borders, territory, and visible force. Even during the early 20th century, war was something you could point to on a map. You could draw lines, you could defend them, you could hide behind them. That assumption collapsed during the Cold War. After the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union entered a confrontation unlike any before. It was not defined by constant battles, but by constant suspicion. Both sides believed that the next war would not begin with a declaration, but with a surprise. Nuclear weapons compressed time itself. Decisions would be made in minutes, sometimes seconds. In that environment, information became more valuable than firepower. Whoever knew first would survive longer. At the beginning, intelligence was limited. Spies crossed borders. Reconnaissance planes flew dangerous missions over hostile territory. Radar stations scanned the horizon, trying to detect incoming threats before it was too late. But all of these systems had limits. Planes could be shot down, agents could be captured, radar could be fooled or overwhelmed. There were still places the state could not see. That uncertainty created fear, but also opportunity. By the late 1950s, American strategists began to look upward. If land was contested and airspace was dangerous, the answer might lie above both. Space offered something no battlefield had ever provided before: distance without borders. In 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world focused on prestige. What mattered more was what Sputnik revealed. An object could orbit the Earth, pass over every country, and no one could stop it. The sky was no longer neutral. The United States understood the implication immediately. If something could orbit freely, it could also observe freely. Cameras could replace pilots. Orbits could replace borders. Surveillance could become continuous rather than episodic. This was not about curiosity, it was about control. Early American satellite programs were developed in secrecy, driven by a simple objective: remove uncertainty. Instead of guessing how many missiles the Soviet Union had, satellites could count them. Instead of relying on intercepted conversations, they could see factories, airfields, and test sites directly. For the first time, strategic intelligence no longer depended on human access. It depended on physics. Satellites did not negotiate, they did not defect, they did not get tired. They followed predictable paths, silently crossing sovereign airspace without asking permission. International law had no clear answer for this intrusion. Space existed in a legal vacuum, and that vacuum was quickly filled with power. What made this shift so destabilizing was not just the technology itself, but the psychological effect it produced. If the sky could see everything, then secrecy became fragile. Military planning changed, deterrence changed, even diplomacy changed. The assumption that states could hide their true capabilities no longer held. The Cold War had entered a new phase. Not one defined by armies facing each other across borders, but by machines watching from above. The battlefield expanded upward into a domain where detection was constant and invisibility was no longer guaranteed. And once the sky stopped being neutral, the balance of power stopped being stable. This was only the beginning, because seeing the world from above would soon create a more dangerous question. Seeing was not enough. You also needed to know exactly where everything was. For decades, secrecy had been the foundation of Soviet power. Military strength depended not only on weapons, but on uncertainty: how many missiles existed, where they were located, whether production was increasing or slowing. What could be hidden mattered as much as what could be built. Strategic ambiguity was not a flaw, it was a shield. Satellite surveillance shattered that shield. As American reconnaissance satellites quietly entered orbit, the Soviet Union faced a problem it had never encountered before. Its territory could be observed without warning, without violation of borders in the traditional sense, and without the ability to respond. Factories, launch sites, airfields, and troop movements were no longer abstract estimates. They were images. The consequences were immediate, even if they were not public. Suddenly, the Soviet military could no longer rely on deception at scale. Dummy installations, concealed construction, and selective disclosure lost effectiveness. Patterns emerged over time. Activity could be compared across months and years. What was built, expanded, or abandoned became visible. This visibility disrupted decades of strategic planning. Soviet air defense doctrine had been built on the assumption that threats would be detected as they approached, not observed continuously in preparation. Early warning systems were designed to respond, not to be watched in advance. Satellites reversed that logic. They allowed the United States to observe preparations long before any action occurred. The element of surprise eroded. What made this especially destabilizing was the asymmetry of response. The Soviet Union could not easily neutralize satellites without escalating into open conflict. Shooting down objects in orbit risked militarizing space in ways neither side fully controlled. Jamming or deception provided limited relief. Once the observation infrastructure existed, it could not simply be undone. Secrecy became conditional. Internally, this triggered deep anxiety within the Soviet leadership. Reports began to circulate acknowledging that American intelligence assessments were becoming increasingly accurate. Missile counts aligned too closely with reality. Test sites once considered hidden appeared in Western analyses. The margin of uncertainty, the space where power could hide, narrowed. For a system built on centralized control and managed information, this was deeply threatening. The problem was not that the United States knew everything. It was that the Soviet Union no longer knew what the United States knew. Strategic planning depends on assumptions about the enemy's ignorance. When that ignorance disappears, so does confidence. This loss of confidence affected more than military calculations. It influenced diplomacy, arms negotiations, and internal trust. Leaders were forced to assume that every move was being watched. Every construction project, every deployment, every test carried the risk of exposure. The sky had become an observer. In response, the Soviet Union invested heavily in countermeasures, camouflage, concealment techniques, hardened facilities, and dispersed infrastructure. But these were adaptations, not solutions. They reduced clarity, but they did not restore invisibility. The balance had shifted permanently. What satellite surveillance ultimately destroyed was not just secrecy, but control over narrative. Power had always depended on managing what others could see and believe. Now, belief could be checked against imagery, claims could be verified, denials became weaker. And once secrecy breaks, fear changes form. The Soviet Union was no longer afraid of surprise attacks alone. It was afraid of being known. That fear would drive the next transformation, one far more precise and far more unsettling. Because seeing the enemy was no longer the ultimate advantage. Knowing exactly where everything was would change the rules entirely. Seeing the enemy changed the balance of power, but it did not solve the most dangerous problem of the Cold War. Observation alone was not enough. Satellites could show factories, missile silos, and airfields. They could reveal patterns of production and deployment. But modern warfare was no longer static. The most decisive weapons were mobile, hidden, and designed to disappear before they could be targeted. Submarines carrying nuclear missiles moved silently beneath the oceans. Mobile launchers could change position between satellite passes. Aircraft could be dispersed, relocated, or concealed. Knowing that something existed did not mean knowing where it was at the critical moment. For military planners, this uncertainty was unacceptable. Deterrence depended on precision. A second strike capability required confidence that targets could be located accurately, not approximately. Nuclear strategy was no longer about destruction alone. It was about timing, coordination, and certainty. This created a new obsession. If power depended on knowing where the enemy was, then the next step was clear. The battlefield needed to be mapped continuously. Space had already removed borders from observation. Now it had to remove ambiguity from location. This shift marked a deeper transformation in how states understood control. Earlier forms of power relied on surveillance as a snapshot, moments of visibility separated by gaps. What Cold War strategists increasingly sought was permanence, a world where position itself became data, where movement could be measured, predicted, and corrected in real time. This idea extended far beyond warfare. Logistics, navigation, coordination, and command all depended on knowing exact position. Aircraft needed precise routes. Missiles required exact coordinates. Naval forces needed to synchronize across vast distances. Even errors measured in meters could translate into catastrophic failure. Approximation was no longer sufficient. At the same time, the complexity of modern military systems was growing beyond human management. Command structures became layered, automated, and time-sensitive. Decisions had to be made faster than human perception alone allowed. Machines were increasingly responsible for translating information into action. This produced a paradox. The more technology expanded the state's ability to see, the more it exposed the limits of human control. Information arrived faster than it could be processed. Visibility increased, but certainty did not automatically follow. What was needed was not more images. It was a framework that could convert space itself into a stable reference. This realization pushed military planners toward a radical conclusion. Location had to become universal, standardized, and independent of local conditions. Weather, terrain, borders, and visibility could no longer interfere. Position had to be known anywhere at any time without reliance on ground infrastructure. Space offered the answer again. If satellites could observe the Earth, they could also define it. By turning orbit into a reference system, every point on the planet could be fixed within a shared grid. Movement could be tracked against that grid. Weapons could be guided by it. Forces could coordinate within it. This was not merely a technical innovation. It was a conceptual shift. The Earth itself was being transformed into a calculable surface, one where position was no longer relative but absolute. Control no longer required presence. It required alignment with a system that never slept. At this point, the Cold War entered a quieter, more abstract phase. The most important battles were no longer about who could see farther. They were about who could locate with precision and who could act on that knowledge first. The technology that would emerge from this obsession was not designed to guide civilians. It was designed to remove uncertainty from war itself. Turning the Earth into a calculable surface required more than observation. It required a system that could define position with certainty, independent of weather, visibility, borders, or human interpretation. The answer, once again, came from space. What would later be known as GPS did not begin as a navigation tool. It began as a solution to a military problem that had become increasingly urgent during the Cold War. how to know exactly where forces and weapons were at all times, across the entire planet. The earliest versions of this idea emerged from naval strategy. Nuclear submarines, hidden beneath the ocean, formed the backbone of second strike capability. Their power depended on remaining undetected, but also on their ability to launch missiles with extreme accuracy. Even a small error in positioning could translate into massive deviations at intercontinental distances. Traditional navigation was not sufficient. Radio signals could be jammed. Celestial navigation was slow and imprecise. In a nuclear scenario measured in minutes, uncertainty was unacceptable. Satellite-based positioning offered a radical alternative. By using signals transmitted from orbit, receivers on Earth could calculate their position based on timing differences. Space became the reference point. Location was no longer relative to landmarks or maps. It was defined mathematically, continuously, and globally. This was a fundamental break from previous systems of control. Position became data. For military planners, the implications were transformative. Aircraft could strike targets with unprecedented precision. Missiles could be guided dynamically rather than blindly. Forces separated by thousands of kilometers could coordinate as if operating on a single grid. The battlefield was no longer fragmented. It was unified by a shared spatial language. Crucially, this system was built for exclusive use. Early global positioning technologies were classified, restricted, and tightly controlled. Precision itself became a strategic asset. To possess it was to dominate. From the Soviet perspective, this represented a dangerous escalation. Satellite surveillance had already weakened secrecy. Now, positioning technology threatened to remove uncertainty from action itself. Defense systems depended on prediction, delay, and reaction. A world where the adversary could strike precisely from anywhere at any time collapsed those buffers. This was not simply a technological gap. It was a doctrinal shock. Military theory had long assumed that friction, error, and fog were unavoidable elements of war. Global positioning challenged that assumption. It suggested a future where uncertainty could be engineered out of conflict, at least asymmetrically. The Soviet Union attempted to respond with its own systems, but development lagged. Economic constraints, bureaucratic inertia, and systemic inefficiencies slowed progress. More importantly, the conceptual shift had already occurred elsewhere. Control was no longer about mass. It was about precision. As positioning systems matured, they became deeply integrated into planning, logistics, and command structures. War was increasingly imagined as a sequence of coordinates rather than fronts. Strategy moved from maps to grids. Decisions moved from commanders to systems. What made this development especially consequential was its invisibility. Unlike missiles or aircraft, global positioning systems did not announce themselves. They operated silently, continuously, shaping outcomes without spectacle. Their presence was felt only through their effects: faster coordination, cleaner strikes, reduced margins for error. By the time these systems became widely known, they were already indispensable. And although they would eventually be presented as neutral tools, useful for navigation, safety, and convenience, their original logic remained intact. They were built to remove uncertainty, to define space, and to ensure that, in any future conflict, one side would always know exactly where it stood and where its enemy did not. The Cold War did not end with treaties or speeches. It ended quietly, embedded into systems. As global positioning technology matured, it began to escape the narrow confines of military use. What had been designed to guide submarines and missiles was gradually adapted for aircraft, logistics, and eventually civilian infrastructure. The justification was efficiency, safety, progress. The logic, however, remained unchanged. Precision, once introduced, does not disappear, it expands. By the late 20th century, positioning systems had become so deeply integrated into military planning that removing them was unthinkable. Command structures, supply chains, and operational doctrine assumed constant access to accurate location data. War was no longer imagined as chaos shaped by uncertainty, but as a sequence of coordinated movements executed within a shared spatial framework. When the Cold War ended, this framework did not dissolve. It migrated. Global positioning entered civilian life almost invisibly, first through aviation and shipping, then through mapping, telecommunications, and consumer electronics. Eventually, it settled into the most intimate spaces of daily existence. Phones, cars, watches, applications. What had once required classified clearance now required only a signal. This transition was not accompanied by public debate. The system was presented as neutral infrastructure, a tool, not a structure of power. Navigation replaced strategy. Convenience replaced control. The origins of the technology faded from view, even as its reach expanded. But the underlying principle never changed. To function, the system requires continuous transmission, synchronization, and reception. It assumes that location is something to be constantly known, updated, and verified. Movement becomes legible. Space becomes indexed. Behavior becomes traceable. This is not accidental. Systems built to remove uncertainty from war do not suddenly tolerate uncertainty in peace. They reshape expectations. They redefine normality. To be lost becomes an error. To be offline becomes suspicious. To move without leaving a trace becomes abnormal. The Cold War logic persists, not as ideology but as architecture. What once terrified Soviet planners was not merely that the United States could see more clearly. It was that the future of conflict would belong to those who could operate without being seen, while seeing everything else. That asymmetry did not vanish with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It became global. Today, positioning systems underpin emergency services, transportation, finance, and communication. They coordinate economies. They synchronize time itself. Entire societies depend on signals originating far beyond their borders. Most people do not think about this dependence. They experience it as normal. That is precisely what makes it powerful. The most effective systems of control are not enforced through fear, but through reliance. They do not announce themselves as authority, they present themselves as necessity. And once necessity is established, consent becomes irrelevant. The Cold War promised a world divided by ideology and resolved by victory. What it delivered instead was a world quietly organized by systems designed for war, now embedded in everyday life. The sky never returned to neutrality. It simply became familiar. And in a world where location is always known, movement is always logged, and systems never stop listening, control no longer needs to announce itself. It only needs to function.